And I want to welcome you now to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat, which is a series where we talk with writers a little less about the subject of their book and a little bit more about how they wrote it. And that's what we're doing here today with Bryan Washington. One note on Bryan Washington's books, I have them both here, which I will hold up and dance around on either side of my head. They are things that you can purchase. And that is one of the best ways to support a writer's career. So if you're able, please purchase the books. You can write reviews of them. If you can't purchase the book right now, that's okay. Check out your library or some other lending venue and read them there, but do write a review because reviews help writers as well. And Bryan is one of my favorite writers in recent years. So I really hope that everyone buys his books so he keeps writing many, many, many more of them. One last logistical note before I begin with questions. If you have questions, we would really, really like to hear your questions, or at least read them, and I will read them out loud so everyone will hear them. So please use the chat window. I will ask a few of my questions, and we'll sort of go to the questions in the chat window as they arise. So we'll get to as many as we can. There's usually a few more. It looks like we have a lot of people logged in, so I might not get to all of them, but we'll try our best to get to as many as possible, and occasionally ask my own questions. But I have questions too. I'm a fan as well, so and I have the microphone, so I win. Anyway, Bryan, thank you so much for joining us. Could you tell us, please, for those who may not know you and your work, who the heck are you?
Yeah, that's a fun question. Well, thank you all for passing through, especially if this is the first time that you're joining with one of the events. But my name is Bryan Washington. I'm the author of a short story collection called Lot and a novel called Memorial.
Do you have a memorial nearby where I could ask you to read a paragraph or two? Is that handy to you at the moment?
It can be handy, and
okay.
I will, it can be, but I'll read the very, I'll read the very beginning of it. There's just a little bit, yeah. Not really much that you need to go or know going into it because it's the very beginning of the book, yeah. Mike's taking off for Osaka, but his mother's flying into Houston. Just for a few weeks, he says, or maybe a couple of months, but I need to go. The first thing I think is, fuck. The second's that we don't have the money for this. Then it occurs to me that we don't have any savings at all. But Mike's always been good about finances, always cool about separating his checks. It's something I'd always taken for granted about him.
So I want to start with a little talk about prose style, because I'll get to my thoughts in a minute, but what is your prose philosophy? How do you approach words on the page?
That's a pretty broad question, yeah. I mean, I think that for me, specifically, what I'm always impressed by is folks who write the sort of thing that they would like to ultimately read, and folks who find themselves gravitated towards the sort of narratives that they would like to see out in the world. And at least from my vantage point, if someone had written Lot or an iteration of a book that was close to Lot, then I wouldn't have felt as if that were something that I would need to write because I would have read it and enjoyed it. And the same holds true of Memorial. But my starting and finishing both of those books largely stems from my just wanting to read something that was similar to those. So wanting to see the sort of thing I'd like to read, and also readability is really important to me, and particularly readability within narratives that are working with multiple ideas simultaneously. I think that's one of the peaks of technical precision on the page for me specifically, is folks who have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 themes that they're working with simultaneously, but that doesn't hamper the accessibility of the narrative.
Yeah, that's thank you. I'm glad you answered that broadly, because I had specific questions based on that, but I didn't want to impose my own will until I heard. And I think I'm connected. So as I was reading your work and rereading Lots, I'd read that before, and reading Memorial for the first time, I found myself thinking about the idea of transparent or invisible prose, whatever term you want to use there. And that's just meaning prose that doesn't draw attention to itself, that sort of, you almost forget that you're reading as you're going through it. That's sort of how I consider prose. And that's not really something I think about or pay much attention to. And and the concept as a writer, I may be like, whatever, until I read it and oh, that's what they mean. And this was one of those moments oh, I was proven wrong about my dismissals of transparent prose these many times because this prose is so beautiful and transparent. Is that something, whatever term you use, is transparent prose something that you value? You sort of mentioned that a little bit, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I'm keen on, and I found myself gravitating toward regardless of the length of the story that I'm working with. I mean, something that is just immediately visually amenable to that for me, at least, is the removal of quotation marks when I'm distinguishing narrative as it might be depicted on the page and dialogue as it might be depicted on the page. Because at least from my end, when I'm reading a text and I see unpunctuated narrative and I move into those quotation marks within dialogue, is a shift that I make, and it's a silent shift, but it's an implicit shift that I make, moving from narrative to something that someone is saying for some reason or another. So just the simple removal of those quotation marks for me has made a big difference as far as creating a narrative space that has less of those shifts that me or a reader might be implicitly making as they move through the story.
So how did you develop the style that you write in? I mean, from something as technical as, hey, no, I'm not going to use the quotation marks, to was that just your own personal experimentation? Were there influences of that style from your readings and other writings that you love?
Yeah, a lot of it was just incessant reading, you know, seeing folks who were manipulating structure and using it to forward the narrative so that they were both complementary with one another, right? The structure didn't supersede the narrative and the narrative didn't supersede the structure. They were both in tandem with one another. And if you removed one of those entities from any of those given narratives, they'd no longer be what they ultimately were. So reading folks like Jacqueline Woodson and Alex Chi and Ocean Vuong and Helena Yagami and Yoko Ogawa and Hiromi Kawakami, like folks who are really manipulating the visual structures of their stories on the page so that it complements what they're trying to move forward in the text. Like that was really paradigm shifting for me as I sort of ventured more, I suppose, intently into the act of writing. Like even a text like Max Porter's Grief is the Thing with Feathers, which is, you know, quite a short novel, but one that is structurally distinct. And that distinctiveness is one that is inseparable from the content of the book. So seeing that you could do that on the page was deeply important for me when it came time to figure out what I actually wanted to do on the page. And not only the stories that I wanted to tell, but the visual layout of those stories and the larger architecture of what those visual changes over the course of a narrative made for when you took the story in its totality.
That's amazing, and I need to think about that a lot more before I ask a question on it. But I mean, essentially, I have a novel manuscript down, but I read the first thing for the next project, and it's about suburban houses, and so it's like, how can I make the structure of a novel a suburban house that's been added to 15 times over the course of 40 years? Anyway, that's like, how am I actually taking the physical space of the setting? And anyway, so I'm interested in that physical structure aspect right now too. So if I'm distracted for the rest of this conversation, it's just because I'm thinking.
For good reason.
So how much of your style emerges in draft number one versus how much during revision? How much do you nail that first try, and how much you have to sort of tweak as you go along and do however many?
It really depends on the story, you know? I mean, there are certain things that I've written over the course of a weekend or two, and then there are other stories that I've worked with that have taken, you know, quite a long time, like many months. And just thinking of short stories, as far as like the books are concerned, Lot took about 4 years to write altogether, and Memorial took about 3 years to write. 2 years largely drafting and thinking of structure, and 1 year of earnestly working through draft after draft. But it's very seldom that the ending of a narrative surfaces for me within the first draft. More often than not, I'll have a sense of where I would like the story to go, but it'll change. And it'll change because I'll have a better understanding by the end of that first draft or second draft or third draft of who the characters are and what they want out of one another and what they think that they want out of one another and where the conflict resides in between those two entities. And the more that I know about those characters in the world in which they exist, the clearer an ending becomes to me. And that's largely just a matter of figuring out like what is, and it becomes a bit mathematical, which is like not the sexiest way to talk about story, but it's one that's really helpful to me because there are certain things that make themselves apparent as being possible within a narrative, you know, like when I list everything out scene by scene, moment by moment, and also the sub scenes within those moments, I have a sense of what is emotionally viable and what isn't emotionally viable, what's structurally viable, what isn't structurally viable, seeing where emotional weight is and where a reader might feel at any given point in time and why they'll feel that way, or if I need to tone something down or accentuate it a bit more. That largely just comes through draft after draft after draft. So I'm pretty big on many different revisions, although the form that those revisions can take can look quite different.
Fascinating. So just speaking of revision and focusing on language, maybe in like the style of your language, are there any things that you look for specifically to get right as you revise? Is there any one or two objects that you're always like, what's the thing you're always catching in your own writing to tweak or fix? Anything like that?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm writing a thing right now, and the folks that I'm working with are saying that it's like too clear, but usually vagueness is the thing that I fall on. So that is what I ultimately find myself having to go back and edit in draft after draft, you know, trying to get to what is actually happening in a scene. Like, what is the point of the scene, like structurally and also emotionally? What is the reader meant to take away from one moment or another? Because I'll have a sense of it and I'll see it and I'll feel it in the midst of, you know, first draft, second draft, third draft. And so a sixth, seventh, eighth draft becomes where I hone it and make it more apparent. Not so apparent that you lose whatever subtlety that you're aiming for in the midst of trying to tell the story, but visible enough that it's unmistakable when a reader comes across it. So clarity is definitely something that I find myself circling around, and also the readability of it, because I'm really always interested in the oracular nature of a story, like a story that can be said or read or spoken for or from the beginning to end, from character to character, having distinctiveness within each of the voices that the characters are working towards. So working through edits and working through drafts so that the characters are singular, that they're autonomous from one another, and yet the world in which they share is the same. A lot of that really only comes from just fine tuning and fine tuning.
I loved everything you said so far, and I have so many questions. But there are a couple questions in the chat. The first one's actually for me, and that's from Erica asking, am I in a library? No, this is just the bookshelf behind my desk at home. So I'm not in a library, Erica, I'm just at home. First question from the chat. So what guided your decision in choosing the cultures that you made to clash in Memorial?
That's a great question. There's a structural answer and there's a thematic answer. The thematic answer is that there is a certain warmth that I've experienced traveling in Osaka that I've only ever experienced living as a resident within Houston. And the thematic challenge of Memorial for me was trying to figure out what connected those two warmths, or what made each of those respective warmths experience in those cities distinctive from one another. And the structural answer to that is that on its face, Osaka and Houston look as if they're deeply distinct cities from one another, and that one is in a very monocultural country, the other is the most diverse city in the States. One traffics largely in a single language, the other city has many, many, many different languages spoken in tandem with one another. And yet, peeling back a few layers of the cities show that there are similarities, just visibly, and that both of the cities are port cities. So they have quite a few folks that are passing through them culturally, whether through work or for pleasure. They both have very distinct food cultures. The residents, at least in my experience, are very funny, and they're also very proud of their respective cities. So seeing what those connections was interesting to me, and it seemed as if though there were a macro level connection between them. So I wanted to see if and what that would ultimately look like in a narrative, again, because it's the sort of thing that I thought that I might want to read.
Great. So from Melissa, I enjoy a good "Can you go home again" story, and Mike's travels back to Japan makes the familiar fresh. What were your challenges in writing that?
That's a really great question. The biggest issue for me was figuring out what home was to Mike ultimately, because there's home as it can appear to be for a character, right? And there's home as it's actually desired for a character. And a character may not know what they desire at the outset of a narrative. The narrative arc could be them ultimately coming to terms with that question and maybe finding an answer for it or not. But in the author's chair, at least for me, I have to know what, not only what they immediately desire, but also what they'll desire in the future, and the route by which they'll arrive at figuring out what it is that they want. So really trying to figure out what home meant for Mike specifically and all the characters generally, and ultimately ending up on the idea, at least for now, that home could be many different things simultaneously for each of those characters. And a challenge with, for me at least, with the coming home again or returning to a place narrative is whether or not I really need to have a character arrive at that place once they identify where and what they actually want. The recognition, at least for me within Memorial, felt like enough of a conclusion that I didn't need to geographically center Mike one place or another at the end of the novel. Just the acknowledgement and I suppose the discovery that he did have agency in which context he existed and also how he existed in those different contexts felt like enough of a journey for me that the former question could be a bit more anomalous.
Great. So another question, this will, I may follow up with a couple of mine here because this is one of the overall topics I wanted to talk about. So place plays such a strong role in your stories and novel. It's its own character. Where does place come in your writing process compared to characters, senses, et cetera, and how do you evoke place?
That's a really great question. I mean, at least for me, place is as much of a driving force within the narrative as any given character or any given larger structural concern that they may be navigating. And in thinking of narrative and thinking of the narratives that I would like to tell, I'm not only trying to create characters and create scenarios in which they're interacting with one another or problems that they're traversing. I'm trying to create a singular iteration of the world that they're experiencing. So coming to terms with not only where a character is navigating or existing, let's say a narrative like Houston. There's Houston as it's understood in mass, which is kind of a nothing statement because Houston is such a diverse city and there's so many different things happening simultaneously, but also trying to figure out how Houston is understood generally and how that conflicts with how this particular character's iteration of Houston exists within their very particular context. You know, like what parts of a setting does a character have access to and what parts do they not have access to? And within the parts that they do have access, what are the opportunities or not that they find themselves gravitating toward? Or what are the pleasures that this particular character has? And what can the setting do to accommodate the character's pleasures or not? Right? If a character is seeking something and a particular setting is not amenable to the thing that is being sought, then what does that do to a particular character? What does that do to the plot of the narrative? Those are usually questions that I'm circling around to one extent or another.
And I think the main answer to all the questions we asked tonight is that you think way harder about this than I ever do. So
well, everyone thinks about it. Everyone thinks about it.
You do. It's just you have a very good thought process about this, and I am envious and impressed, and I understand now the results being so good. But on setting issues, I had a couple questions on that related to what you just said. Since you live in Houston, that's one of the settings. How do you balance the reality of the place with your imagination? Because I'm a writer who loves to write from imagination. I tend to write away from reality. And relatedly, do you feel an obligation to be absolutely true to the place, or can you take some liberties with your writing of it?
That's a really great question. For me, what I ultimately end up circling around is thinking through those contexts, right? Because there's Houston as it's understood. If you were to look at a map, these are the given parameters. These are the city limits. This is where one hub or another is. And that's, you know, a certified, you can check that is probably going to be understood in mass by folks. So that is a distinct entity. And yet an individual's experience of the city is going to be distinct from that understanding. You know, if a character spends the overwhelming majority of their time on the page in Montrose, for example, then Montrose is Houston for that particular character. And if that character navigates solely queer spaces within Montrose, then Houston is a queer space for that particular character. That may not align with a one-to-one correlation to the larger understanding of Houston, but that doesn't make it less true because it's a singular iteration that's experienced by those particular characters. So really trying to figure out how a story can exist in that liminal space between that singular experience of the city and the city as it's known or largely thought to be experienced is where a lot of editing takes place for me, because you can't negate the former, because then you lose your credibility and you lose your foundation as far as how the city is understood to be. But you don't want to negate the latter either, because that's where the story is. And the story is made up of what a character wants, desires, sees, and so on, or doesn't see, as it were. So really trying to figure out where within that liminal space the story can reside. And oftentimes that dial moves from one space to another over the course of the narrative. But the thinking about it and being aware of it is where the draft starts for me, at least.
So one more setting question before returning to chat questions.
Yeah.
So reading a lot in particular, where we have this sort of cumulative growth of an image of Houston as presented in the novel, as you just described it some, what makes a good detail for creating, like a scenic detail for creating a moving, memorable setting? How, because I've never been to Houston. And so like, this is all in my mind basically from your book. Like
scary.
If it's not like that when I visit, I'm gonna be totally peeved, but
you'd be justified. Yeah.
So how do you think of detail? What details do you seek out to make these? Because you're not trying to paint Houston as a whole. You're not dropping the obvious Houston landmarks. How do you create the small scale of the place? How do you pick those details? What's the setting creation techniques you might use, or at least some of them?
Yeah, so what is on the forefront of my process is figuring out what is important to a particular character, right? Like what is a certain thing that a character will notice and what do they derive meaning from? Because meaning can be derived from, you know, damn near anything that you ascribe it to, right? Like if a particular crosswalk has meaning for a character, if we, the author, tell the reader that this crosswalk is meaningful to this character and we tell them why, then it is meaningful, right? Just by way of our imparting that within the narrative. And that's one of the cool things about story is that you can say it and it can be true so long as you aren't pulling too far away from that sort of foundational understanding of the city. So really trying to figure out what is important to a character and what that importance is doing to drive the narrative forward. Because it's one thing to just say that, okay, this crosswalk is important to character A and then to move on from it. It's quite another to say that this crosswalk is important to character A and have that crosswalk have a pivotal, even if only an implicit role in the progression of the narrative as it moves forward, because that shows the reader just by page space alone that this is a landmark within this particular narrative, even if only within this particular narrative, but within this particular character's understanding of Houston, it's important. I think that one thing that really hamstrung me when I initially started writing about Houston was leaning too far into what I felt was the expectation to get everything right, whether geographically or thematically. And that felt for me, at least, to be like a bit of a trap, because no person's understanding of a place, whether it's a city as big as Houston or it's a small town, is going to be the same. Like if you have take any two people, they're going to notice things differently because their experiences and their vantage points and their respective personal canons of experiences and entertainment that they've consumed are going to color them through different visages, you know. So that gives you a lot of leeway trying to present a place with a very singular perspective. So trying to find the balance between the two has been really important to me. But something that might be a bit more, I don't know, like structurally useful is that usually if I have a page, 25% of that page is going to be building the world or reinforcing the world that I've built in some way, shape, or form, whether that is building the world through description, whether that's building the world through a character's navigation of that world or memory of their navigation of it, or a conversation that's taking place in the midst of their navigating it. I try to keep, that quarter of any given page resorted for world building. And it can look like a lot of different things, and it doesn't sound like a lot, just like a quarter of a page. But over the course of a narrative, those quarters adds up. And by the end of the story, then you have a sort of world, or a very singular iteration of a world, ideally.
My one rule for myself, I wrote the current manuscript is set in Savannah, Georgia, where I'm from. My one rule to myself was no mentions of Spanish moss, because that is the cliched Savannah detail, and anything ever written about Savannah, there's a talk about the Spanish moss. So I was like, there's going to be a single mention of Spanish moss in this. But slightly more seriously too, I think writers underestimate sometimes the simple power of returning to something. Like, it's mechanical almost. Like, oh, this thing I've mentioned, go back and read what you wrote. What things did you mention maybe didn't notice? And it's like, pluck that, pull it to a later spot. It was important to you when you wrote it then, so there was import to it. It meant something. It'll mean something later, and find the ones that really, really mean something. And there's some power in that. And it's mechanical and kind of simple.
Yeah, to that point, it's probably worth mentioning that oftentimes if I'm drafting, like there are excerpts or moments or sections that in my editing feel as if they don't quite fit, or as if they aren't the right tone, or they aren't moving the narrative forward the way that I would like them to. And I don't delete those moments. I just copy and paste them in a different draft that is usually just full of moments like that. And more often than not, a different narrative will arise, or later on in a narrative, I'll see that, okay, maybe this exact iteration of the thing that I wrote didn't fit, but something like it could fit, and just paste it in there. Or there might be a story that arrives where it makes absolute sense of this particular moment, and in lieu of having just trashed it, I can just copy and paste it and make edits accordingly. None of it's really wasted, so just trying to find different ways to utilize things that may or may not fit in a particular story.
So now back to the chat for our most important question of the night. What is the map on your wall?
That's Osaka.
Okay, great.
Very short answer. Sorry, not too interesting.
How long were you in Osaka?
I suppose sans the pandemic, I'm usually there once or twice a year. I've been going for the past 6 years or so, mostly to visit friends, at least before I started working on the book.
All right, so I really like this question from the chat. What made you decide to structure Benson's narrative in chapters, but Mike's in paragraph breaks?
That's a really great question. So for me, there are multiple readings for Memorial, and something that I found quite early is that your reader doesn't have to be aware of all of the readings that you yourself are trying to impart within a narrative, but that doesn't take away from their implicitly feeling them and reading them and seeing them, So in some respects, Ben and Mike's narrative trajectories are singular from one another. They are a couple and they're navigating the novel together, but Benson's narrative is ultimately of someone who learns to speak up for himself, and Mike's narrative is of someone who ultimately learns to listen to others, or how to listen to others, and how to intuit what they need. And once I realized that, okay, this is something thematically that I would like to do, I turned to that other question that I rely on, is visually within the novel structure-wise, how can I make that happen? And for me, what it ended up looking like was taking Ben's narrative and elongating his statements and his sections over the course of the book, so that in the first section of the novel, Ben gets 2 sections. He gets the first section, the third section. Mike gets the second section. So in the first section of the novel, when we first meet Ben, there are some chapters and sections that are only one line, or a handful of lines, or a handful of paragraphs. And within those sections, regardless of their length, Ben speaks very, very, very little, right? But as the book progresses, the amount of time that Ben actually spends speaking dialogue-wise on the page increases, and the length of his sections ultimately also increase. And this is a character that is coming into himself. And one way of showing that on the page is allowing him more space to have those conversations, and allowing him more space to really act on the things that he would like to acquire. Whereas for Mike's section, it was a little bit trickier to untangle when I was trying to plow through it. But he's ultimately someone who is learning how to shut up in a lot of ways, how to intuit the desires of those around him in lieu of imparting his own desires. So when we first meet him at the beginning of his section, there are many different run-ons, right? It's clause after clause after clause after clause, seemingly not making any sort of structural sense, just talking and trying to get whatever he's going through out on the page. But as his particular section progresses, the clauses get shorter and the sentences get shorter, and the amount of time that we actually see Mike speaking on the page, it diminishes significantly. So that by the time we return to Mike in the third section, Ben's section, even when folks are addressing Mike directly, and they know that he has something to say and they're leaning to his answer, he won't say anything. There will just be silence. So really trying to figure out what the arcs of the characters were and how to embellish those through the structure yielded what it ended up looking like for me. But it was also just as important for me, in a story that's about a relationship between these two guys, to give them nearly equal page space to really hard line that distinction in the way that they view the world. So it came down to a word count of Benson gets just over 1,100 more words than Mike, and I really wanted it to get 1-to-1 because the story's about both of them. I wanted them both to have equal credence on the page, but I just wasn't good enough to do that at the time. But having a narrative in which we see a relationship from these respective vantage points, even if the way that these characters are internalizing the events that occur is very different. Playing with that structure was something that really helped me think through it.
I love your talk about manipulating the physical appearance of things on the page, so the physical length of things, and I think that's something doesn't get talked a lot about in craft, but it really is. You're talking about an object, and there's ways to affect what you're trying to affect with Benson in particular. More things I'll be thinking about for a long time. But that also brought up one of my favorite moments in Memorial, which was you read through the entire first Benson section, and you're in his perspective, and then you suddenly switch to Mike's point of view, and immediately realize that your entire understanding of Mike up to that point had been from Benson's perspective, had been skewed by his own issues and the drama of a relationship, the normal everyday drama even of a relationship. And I immediately found Mike relatable in a way he hadn't been up to that point. I'd been Team Benson for like this entire start of the book, and then suddenly like, oh. And so you as an author made me sort of think wrong and incomplete thoughts, and I respect you for that. That was a brilliant writing move. Like that was just like another like. I feel like there's some thriller trick you adopted there to steer me along, and then like, oh, I followed the clues wrong. I followed this one person's perspective, and it was a really great moment. So both characters have such clear and contrasting personalities as part of that. And for an author working with access to multiple point of views for another author, do you have any tips or tricks you'd say for maintaining that clear separation of two people with two different minds?
Yeah, for me, what was immediately applicable, and this holds true even if I'm working within a character's singular perspective, but they're interacting with other characters that are speaking and appearing in and out of their particular narrative, is varying the sentence structures of the folks that are speaking at any given point in time or thinking at any given point in time on the page. Just those slight variations, whether it is one character largely speaking in run-on sentences, another character speaking in clipped sentences, or one character internalizing dialogue through unblocked or unmarked prose, and another character having deeply punctuated moments of dialogue. Changes like that, changes in terms of speaker tags, like perhaps one character intuits questions with says in lieu of asks. Really small things. They seem small, but they add up a good deal over time, so that you end up with two characters or however many characters that have very distinct modes of seeing the world and internalizing the things that they see. The other thing that was immediately helpful for me was just reading their voices aloud, seeing where the variations within those voices, seeing where they are and how they're different, and if you need to play up a bit more of a difference for one character or for another character. Just honestly reading what I've written aloud and reading dialogue in particular aloud, particularly when it's exchanges of 3 or 4 characters or more, is really invaluable for me when it comes to figuring out who is saying what and how what they're saying is distinct from the folks around them. So that by the end of that, oftentimes I can remove speaker tags with, 3 or 4 speakers, but I'll still know who is saying what because of the distinct rhythms and their respective ways of seeing the world and speaking. Just reading aloud and trying to vary the sentence structures is something that's been super helpful for me.
That's wonderful thoughts again. So from the chat, I listened to the A24 podcast where you mentioned your book is being adapted for film. What's it like to see your story go from page to screen? Are you worried something will get lost reading versus watching?
That's a great question. Thank you for listening to that podcast. So we're adapting it for television. I may have misspoken on the podcast. We're adapting it for television. It's going to be a limited series. I'm writing it, so that alleviates many, not all, but many of the worries when it's come to what will ultimately end up on the screen. And the worries that do exist largely stem from trying to figure out how to move the tone and much of the emotional weight in the way that really can only be experienced within a text to the screen. And one of the workarounds that I'm finding is that the screen has a very specific set of things that you can do that you can accomplish like within a script, within a visual medium that are a bit more difficult on the page, for example, right? Like silence, like telling a reader that characters are sitting in silence, that's a line or two saying, oh, they sat in silence. That's one thing. And showing those characters sharing perhaps an uncomfortable silence for 20 seconds in an extended shot on screen, that's a very different feeling, right? It's the same thing that's occurring, but they're internalized differently by the audience. So really trying to figure out what those differences are and how to really play off of the benefits that the visual medium can provide. That might be a bit trickier on the text, but A24 and the folks that we're working with, they've been really lovely and helpful as far as trying to figure out how to make that work.
So this is a comment from the chat. Someone who reads a lot in a Houston Metro bus, and that both books shout Houston for them. So a thank you for shouting Houston in your work.
Thank you, reader. Thank you.
As you work through, this is a good question. As you work through your drafts, how much input did you get from others, such as agents and editors, and how much did you incorporate into revisions?
That's a really great question. So I can say, I'll speak on Lot first, and then I'll speak on Memorial. For Lot, that was a very specific experience, and that it is 10 stories, I want to say, and 6 of them were published in lit journals elsewhere prior to them being compiled and submitted as a manuscript for publication. So I'd worked with at least 6 different editors on those 6 stories that had been published prior to compiling them, and then I worked with my book editor, but our task was very different from that of a single stories editor. Whereas with with Tin House, the trouble was trying to figure out, okay, how to make this single story exist in a singular iteration as an autonomous narrative. And in terms of the book, it became the story exists in a singular iteration, but how do we ingratiate it within this larger narrative so that in lieu of it just being one story out of a book, it is a story that is a part of the world in which this book is trying to depict. So quite a lot of hands were on Lot prior to my book editor even, setting her eyes on it to start with. Whereas for Memorial, I went through quite a lot of drafts prior to anyone else even reading it. And that was largely because there weren't very many comps that I had, or very many direct comps that I had for Memorial, which is to say that there weren't very many books that I could turn to and say that, okay, Memorial will reach this audience and it'll sell this many units and it can be marketed this way because these are 4 different books that are very similar to this particular book. Didn't really have that for Memorial. So I knew that the iteration of it that I submitted to my agent and the iteration of it that we submitted to our editor, I wanted it to be as close as possible to the thing that I was trying to do as it could, so that when it did go through the rounds of edits and it did go through the sorts of changes that it did, it remained as close as possible to the original iteration or the original vision that I originally had. But generally, I don't show first, second, or even third drafts to anyone else. Once I hit a third draft, I might show it to 2 or 3 friends that I really trust and who's, you know, understanding some stories I really trust. All of whom, no, most of whom aren't writers, right? Just their understanding of stories are just ones that I really admire and think highly of. And then I'll show it to my agent. We'll work through the sort of comments and, you know, the sort of conversations around that story. And then, you know, I'll either show it to my editor, my book editor, or I'll show it to the editor of whatever entity that I would like to write for, or we'll submit it out into the larger world.
I don't think I get to like probably an 8th draft before I'm like want someone else to see it. No, you can't see this until it's done. I have a friend though who like will share the messiest, most unfinished drafts. And you're like, what is this? Then he'll come back with the next one. It's like, oh, it's amazing. Like he just like he really wants that talk at the beginning, and then he goes off and does his thing, comes back with the amazing thing. So it's I'm always amazed.
Whatever works.
Yeah.
Whatever works.
From the chat, parents play a big role in Memorial. Can you talk about how you write these parents? And I guess this is sort of a chicken egg question. Mike is very much his parents' son and Benson is too. Did the families grow out of the character, or did you sort of know how the family dynamic would be when you began?
That's a really great question. It is very much the former, right? Like much of writing Memorial was figuring out who Mike and Ben were in the midst of drafting and in the midst of writing, and taking those discoveries and applying them to further drafts, so that by the time I had the iteration of the draft that I was comfortable showing to my agent, and then the one we were comfortable showing to my editor, I had a really keen understanding of who these characters were and what they wanted in a way that just wouldn't have been possible for me to have at the outset of writing it, because I didn't know them through however many drafts and through however many revisions and changes and alterations over the course of the text. What was a guiding light for me over the course of writing the story was wanting to tell a narrative in which characters had the autonomy and the flexibility to come close to one another, which is an autonomy and flexibility that I think can sometimes be taken away from certain characters. So using that as a guiding light in all of their interactions was something that was really helpful when it came to figuring out how Mike related to Eju and how that changed over the course of the narrative, or how Ben related to Lydia, or how Ben related to his mom or his father, and how that changed over the course of the narrative. Just really telling myself that they would and should have that flexibility to change, and not, or rather attempting not to put them in static roles, was something that was a guiding light when it came to trying to figure out, okay, how do they relate to one another? How does what they want change over the course of the narrative, and how does that alter how they relate to one another? And also, what are their understandings respectively of one another? Like, how do they view each other, and how does that conflict with how they actually are? Like, is there actually a liminal difference in between those, and what is that difference, and how can that difference be extrapolated, like, to create conflict, right? Because there's inherent conflict whenever you have a character who has a prescribed role in their relationship with another character, and perhaps there's a difference in how those characters view that particular role or view that relationship. For example, like if Eju thinks that, you know, Mike is his son, which he is, he's his biological son, and yet he may have a role that Eju doesn't think a son should have, or Mike can see Eju, who is his father, and think, okay, this is not how a father should behave or how a father should be. And so you have conflict in those respective expectations. Figuring out what all that is for any given character, and figuring out how to really pull the most out of it for a given narrative is something that's really helpful.
I love this next comment and question that follows from it. I'm always so moved and surprised by the way food cooking appears in your work as a way to enact connection and distance alike between characters. Are there writers whose use of food or writing about food you feel inspired by or in communication?
Yeah, all the time. Yeah, that's really, yeah, all the time. That's a really good question. Folks like Tejal Rao, he writes for the Times right now. Folks like Eric Kim, who now writes for the Times, like now he's going to be writing for the Times. Folks like whenever Helen Oyeyemi uses food, it's really lovely and great. Whenever John Birdsall writes about food, he actually had a book that was released like fairly recently. It's really lovely. It's really inspiring and great to me. who else is working with food? This is always like one of those scary questions because before you're asked it, you can think of 50 different people, but the moment you're asked it, it's just like you don't even read, you don't have books in your home. Harami Kawakami, like she uses food in her translated works, or rather the works that have been translated into English, and that's always really great and fun to read. Helen Rosner, of course, she's someone who writes about food in a really fun and flexible and dynamic way. Yeah, there are loads and loads of folks that are working with food. The guy Michon, who works over at the Times, also comes to mind. Hannah Goldfield, who is over at the New Yorker, actually comes to mind as far as someone who's like really working with food and doing exciting things with it. Quite a few folks. Michael Twitty, many, many different people.
I love that you mentioned Harumi Kawakami too, though, because I started reading her work last year.
Yeah.
I was like, where was
She's
this?
So great.
Where was this?
Yeah, she's so great.
Yeah. So from the chat, I love your riffing on writing what you want to read and not stories you feel like have already been told. What types of queer narratives do you feel like are still missing from the canon, and how has that impacted what you haven't included in your stories?
That's a really great question. So there are so many different narratives within like a singular queer experience that if you have an idea for a narrative within that particular experience, it almost certainly hasn't been told just by way of you not having told it or not having seen the iteration of it that's been depicted in narrative form. Yeah. So what is usually my guiding light when it comes to telling narratives is just wanting to write the sort of thing that I would like to read, but also writing in a way that I don't feel as if though I have to justify or as if though I have to translate or as if though I have to make concessions within the narrative for a party or an entity or a reader that is perhaps not deeply familiar with the characters or the environs or the contexts that I'm working within, right? Like I'm working on a few different things right now, and there's a constant, I suppose, battle for me at least between telling the story that I would like to tell and providing enough details about that particular world so that a reader who isn't intimate with all of those details isn't gridlocked out of it by way of their not having all the language or not having any of the experiences or the context. And it is, that's a line that moves over the course of telling the story, and it moves over the course of editing, oftentimes one way or the other, and it's very rarely a consistent place that it ends up in. But what I usually settle onto is just wanting to tell or write the sort of thing that I would want to see to the degree and within the iteration that I would like to see it. I mean, if you're writing a narrative, or really if I'm writing a narrative and I catch myself over explaining something, I oftentimes go back and I delete that thing. The question that I'll ask myself from time to time is, if there are characters that are experiencing an iteration of the world, is this something that they would have to explain to one another, or is it something they would have to justify to one another, or would these characters need to utilize an explanatory comma where they say this thing, which is actually da, 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 and then continuing the narrative? That's something that they would need to do in their interactions with one another. The overwhelming majority of the time, the answer is no, and then I get rid of that thing. So really leaning into trying to tell the story in lieu of trying to justify the story is something that's really important to me.
Wonderful. So this is from the chat, prefaced with the sentence, here's a question every writer hates getting. But here at the Writer Center, we love, it's actually two questions too, and at the Writer Center, we love them both. So Bryan, you're going to be subjected to them based on the Writer Center's desire to share these answers.
That's fair.
Anyway. Do you have any advice for getting published in lit mags, or what your process journey to publication, what has that looked like?
So I will answer the latter, and within the latter, hopefully there's an answer to the former. The answer to the former grows trickier and trickier every day, and by the time that I give you an answer, you're going to be able to log in at Twitter and see that it's no longer viable or possible. For Lot specifically, the route was publishing in lit journals, and that often resulted from me submitting cold because I didn't know the editors that worked at these journals. I didn't know people who knew the editors that worked at these journals. So I would submit in general admin, or I would do the thing that you're allegedly not supposed to do, but I did it, and I know folks who did it, and they didn't dissolve into thin air. Where I would look at the masthead of a particular journal, and I would email that person directly. Just a very polite, opener. It was like, "Hello, my name is da 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 da. Here's a story with however many words. Hopefully you enjoy it. Totally cool. If not, thanks." Right? Not really expecting anything out of it, but I would send it nonetheless. Sometimes that didn't work. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it was lovely. But submitting to lit journals after I think 4 or 5 of the stories that were published within Lot were published, the possibility of like a book surrounding that seemed viable, or at least possible. So I started querying agents and reaching out to agents, and I had a handful of conversations with folks. Luckily, I met my agent, Danielle Bukowski, quite early. A question that I asked all of my agents, because I think something that's really important to remember is that when you're querying agents, like this is someone that is going to be working with you, and they're also going to be working for you, and they're going to be your representative in lieu of your presence in various conversations. So that is something that's really important to keep in mind. So this is someone who's going to be representing you to editors, to publishers, in lieu of your being present in a given place. And a question that I've asked all the agents that I queried was like, what are you reading, or what have you really enjoyed? That thinned out the folks that I would be comfortable working with quite quickly. And I was really lucky to meet Danielle very early on. So once we met, we compiled what was an iteration of Lot. We submitted that to various publishers. I was quite lucky to be connected with Riverhead quite early on in that process, and they ultimately ended up publishing Lot. For Memorial, it was a slightly different process because Lot was a one-booked contract. That's something I've talked about in other places, but Lot was a one-book contract without the assured promise of a second book. Although if there were a second book, Riverhead would have the sort of first look option on it. So with that process, I pitched my agent various ideas. We settled eventually on Memorial, or the concept of Memorial as it existed then, as being the next sort of book. We took that. I wrote 20, 25 pages of what the narrative was or could be, sent that to my editor over at Riverhead. And because there was not, a locked in second book contract, I took that iteration and I took, 2 years to work on it. And that's really when I drafted and I edited and I showed it to friends, showed it to my agent, went back, drafted and edited. The downside of not having that 2-book contract is that you are not on contract for that second book. So if, it doesn't work out, then it doesn't work out. The benefit to not having that 2-book contract is that you are flexible in a lot of ways to tell the sort of story that you would like to tell. So it wasn't an instance of me saying, okay, it'll be this kind of story, and then turning in an entirely different kind of narrative, which is helpful for Memorial specifically because I didn't know how the story would ultimately end. So that did give me a little bit of flexibility. But ultimately I ended up finishing an iteration that I was comfortable with of Memorial, sent that final iteration to my agent. We submitted it to my editor over at Riverhead. She was cool with it. They accepted it, and the publication process proceeded from the back end from there out.
It's interesting too that the 2-book contract used to be a little more standard, and part of that is hesitance of publishers for it, but also agents now, I think, don't want to get locked in if there's a chance for the second book being a bigger deal. If the first book does really well and you're locked into that second book contract, then you get what that second book contract is, even if your first book absolutely explodes on the scene. So there's some agents who are hesitant for the 2-book contract now as well. So it's personal preference to writer, agent, editor, really.
Many different factors. Yeah, there's not really a right way. The best way is the way that's best for you.
Process question, and before we wrap up for the evening, how much of Lot or Memorial was written before or during at your MFA program, and how much was either book shaped by that experience? So the value of an MFA program for practically producing work, and then also just influencing you beyond the MFA program.
Yeah, so for that latter question, like the value of an MFA program for me specifically, I think that if the program is paying for you to be there, which I distinguish between, paying for your education. Like if you are making money whilst you are there and you have an idea in place, like great, then it's very much worth it. But for me specifically, much of lot was written in the midst of my MFA program, not all of it, and about half of the stories were submitted to my MFA program, but I received the deal for lot a year into the program. So there were a handful of stories that didn't appear within the MFA program itself, and I spent much of my time in the MFA actually editing with my editor at Riverhead for publication. The program was really helpful for me in that, I was making money while I was there. I had another job in Houston, so I was living between cities at the time. I would work in Houston and come back to this MFA program in New Orleans, and I would go back to Houston and vice versa. So I was in a situation where I had a steady source of income, and that made it viable for me because it didn't feel like lost time or wasted time. And also I got to work with really lovely folks. So it was beneficial for my particular situation. Is the MFA the only route to take? Absolutely not. I know quite a few people who have not seen or heard of an MFA and are doing quite all right, the larger publishing world. But for memorial, that was not written within the MFA. I had left by the time that I really started working earnestly on it. But I will say that there were, folks that I worked with in conversations that I had that only benefited both of those books because it was more time that I spent thinking about story and the various ways in which it could work. So was it essential or is it essential? I don't think so. Can it be beneficial? Absolutely, if it is beneficial for your particular situation.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So we're gonna wrap up there. We've reached our cutoff time. I first want to encourage everyone to get a copy of the book, read the book, enjoy the book, review the book, tell everyone about the book, because once you read it, you'll definitely want to. It's a masterpiece of writing, and as is Lot. So there's a couple books, if you haven't read them, that you should definitely check out. As for the Writer Center, please go to our website, writer.org, and check out all the workshops and a bunch of free event programming we have coming up. We hope to see you all again at something in the future. Bryan, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my God.
I'm going to rewatch this
Yeah.
one. Absolutely rewatch this one because I miss things in the hosting that I want to hear. So thank you.
Thank you so much, y'all. Please take care and stay safe. Yeah.